The letter arrived at the Fort Worth post office on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and it sat there, uncollected for 11 days before Elijah Graves decided that some things in this world simply could not wait for the ordinary machinery of civilization to catch up with them. He was 26 years old, lean as a fence rail, with sun-darkened skin and hands that had been shaped by rope and saddle leather into something that looked like they belonged to a man twice his age. His dark eyes carried a kind of quiet intensity that people in Caldwell County had learned to read carefully, because when Elijah Graves fixed those eyes on something, he had already made up his mind about it, and no amount of sensible argument was going to change the direction he was traveling. He worked cattle for the Rocking T Ranch, had done so for 4 years since coming down from Missouri after his father passed, and he was good at it the way a man is good at something when he has no other choice but to be. The post office was run by a round-faced man named Gerald Prout, who wore the same green suspenders every single day of his life, and who had a talent for remembering which letters belonged to which people, and what roads those people had taken out of town. Elijah came in on a Wednesday, having ridden 2 hours from the Rocking T just to check if anything had come for him from his cousin back in Missouri, and Gerald Prout handed him a thin envelope and said, while he was at it, that there was a letter for the Dawson homestead out on the Cimarron side of the Palo Duro that had been sitting in the box for near 2 weeks with no one to collect it. Dawson homestead, Elijah said, turning the thin envelope over in his fingers. His own letter was from his cousin about a land dispute that could wait. That is a far piece of writing. It is, Gerald said. Closest thing to a mail route that goes out that direction is Clem Hodder's supply wagon, but Clem broke his axle 3 weeks ago and won't be running again until June at the earliest. I was going to hold it until then. What kind of letter is it? Elijah asked, and then immediately recognized that was a foolish question to ask a postmaster. Gerald gave him the look of a man who had answered that kind of question too many times. The kind that gets sent and needs collecting, he said. Elijah might have let it go. He nearly did. He set his cousin's letter in his breast pocket and was halfway to the door when something made him turn around. He had passed by the Dawson homestead once, 2 summers ago, on a cattle drive that cut northeast through the canyon country. He remembered a garden that someone had coaxed out of the hard caliche soil with what must have been tremendous stubbornness, and he remembered, though he had only glimpsed her from a distance, and for no more than a moment, a young woman hanging laundry on a rope strung between 2 cedar posts. She had red-brown hair that the wind was pulling loose from its pins, and she had laughed at something, at the wind itself maybe, and the sound of it had carried across the open ground between them and settled somewhere in his chest where he had not examined it particularly closely since. I will take it, he said. Gerald looked up from his sorting. You will take it where? Out to the Dawson place. Elijah, that is 4 days of hard riding through canyon country. The post can hold it until Clem gets his wagon sorted. Clem will not have his wagon sorted until June, Elijah said. That is 2 months. Letters wait, Gerald said, with the authority of a man whose entire professional life was organized around that principle. Some do, Elijah said. Hand it over, Gerald. Gerald regarded him for a long moment with those round, thoughtful eyes, and then he reached under the counter and produced a cream-colored envelope sealed with plain wax. The name on the front was written in a fine, educated hand, Miss Helen Dawson. There was no return address. Gerald held it out and Elijah took it. You are a strange man, Elijah Graves, Gerald said. I have heard that, Elijah agreed and walked out into the spring sunlight. He arranged things at the Rocking T without too much difficulty. He had accumulated 2 weeks of time owed to him from the winter roundup, and his foreman, a practical man named Dutch Holloway, waved him off with the instruction to be back before the May branding. He packed light because the country between Fort Worth and the Palo Duro demanded a man travel light if he was going to travel fast, loaded his saddlebags with dried meat, hardtack, a good quantity of coffee, his bedroll, a spare shirt and his rifle, and he put the letter inside a square of oilskin folded flat against his chest, inside his vest, where the weather could not reach it. His horse was a bay gelding named Anchor, who had the disposition of a thoughtful professor, and the endurance of something considerably less academic. Anchor had carried Elijah through 3 cattle drives and 1 very bad thunderstorm in the Panhandle flats, and the horse seemed to understand when the riding ahead was going to be serious work, because he stood still with particular dignity, while Elijah tightened the cinch straps. They left Fort Worth before sunrise on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of April, when the Texas sky was the color of a bruise healing, going from purple to gray to something almost golden at the horizon's edge. The air smelled of cedar and something green and new, the way spring smells in that part of Texas before the heat arrives and burns the softness out of everything. Elijah rode north and west, keeping to the established cattle trails where the ground was firmest and the water crossings were known, and he let himself settle into the long rhythm of distance riding, which is its own kind of meditation if a man will let it be. He thought about the letter against his chest. He thought about the woman who was supposed to receive it. He thought about how strange it was that he was doing this, riding 4 days through rough country to deliver a piece of paper that the post office was perfectly capable of holding for 2 months, and he could not account for it except in the way that certain impulses resist accounting and simply demand to be acted on. The first day took him 30 miles, through the flat brushland north of Fort Worth, where the mesquite grew in dense thickets, and the mockingbirds were loud and argumentative in the branches. He made camp near a shallow creek, built a small fire, boiled his coffee in the battered tin pot he kept rolled in his bedroll, and ate salt pork and hardtack while Anchor drank from the creek and pulled at the sparse grass on the bank. The night was cool but not cold, and the stars came out in that extraordinary abundance that only appears far from town, the kind of sky that makes a man feel simultaneously very small and also, paradoxically, like he belongs to something vast and important. He lay on his back looking up at it and thought about what he would say when he arrived. He had not thought that far ahead when he walked out of Gerald Pruitt's post office. He had simply acted. But now, in the quiet of the night, the reality of what he was doing asserted itself. He was riding 4 days to bring a letter to a woman he had seen once from 100 yards away for a duration of approximately 30 seconds. The letter could have been sent by post. The post could have held it until June. None of this was necessary by any measurable definition of the word. And yet here he was, under the stars, with the letter in his vest and his horse breathing peacefully at the edge of the firelight, and he found that he did not particularly regret any of it. The second day was harder. The terrain began to rise as he moved into the rolling hill country that preceded the canyon lands, and the trails became less certain, more suggestion than fact. He passed through a small settlement called Mineral Creek that consisted of a trading post, a blacksmith's forge, a cluster of rough-hewn houses, and a population that seemed to regard strangers with the specific wariness of people who had been disappointed by strangers before. He stopped at the trading post to water Anchor and buy a fresh twist of tobacco that he did not particularly need and would probably give away when he found someone who wanted it, and the man behind the counter, old and weathered as an oak board left in the sun, looked at him with eyes the color of creek water. "Where you headed?" the man asked. "Palo Duro side," Elijah said. "Dawson Homestead." The old man's eyes changed slightly in the way that eyes do when they recognize a name that carries weight. "Helen Dawson's place," he said. "It was not a question. You know it. Know of it. Her father passed last winter pneumonia." He wiped down the counter with a rag that was not making anything cleaner. "She is running that place alone now from what I hear." Elijah absorbed this. "She have any help?" "She has a hired man, older fellow name of Pete Calloway, but Pete's no spring chicken and that is a hard piece of land to work." He paused. "You a friend of hers?" "Not yet," Elijah said honestly, and the old man looked at him for a long moment and then nodded slowly as if that answer made perfect sense. The second night he camped on high ground where the wind came in steadily from the northwest and made sleep a negotiation. He dreamed, when he finally managed it, of the woman he had seen from the cattle drive, her hair coming loose in the wind, her laugh that had crossed 100 yards of open ground and found him without trying. In the dream she turned and looked at him, which she had not done in reality, and her eyes were the kind of gray-green that prairie grass turns in early spring. The third day brought him into the canyon country proper, and here the landscape became something that required a man's full attention. The Palo Duro Canyon system cut through the Llano Estacado in great sweeping channels of red and orange and ochre, the walls of striated rock rising hundreds of feet, and the floor of the canyon threading between them in a narrow river of green, where cottonwood trees grew along the seasonal creek beds. It was country that could swallow a man whole if he was not paying attention, beautiful and indifferent the way only very old things can be. The Comanche had known this country intimately for generations, and had been driven out of it only 4 years before, in 1874, by Colonel Mackenzie's campaign. And riding through it, Elijah felt the weight of that history the way you feel a presence in a room even after the person has left. He was careful with his direction in the canyon country, following the line of a tributary creek that his foreman had described to him from an old cattle drive route, keeping the sun on his left in the morning, and working always to find the higher ground when the trail became uncertain. Anchor navigated the rocky sections with his usual professorial patience, picking each step with deliberate care, and by late afternoon of the third day, Elijah had worked his way through the worst of the canyon terrain, and found the higher flatland on the far side where the grass grew in long, windswept waves of pale gold. He made camp that third night in a hollow sheltered by a rise of red rock, close enough to water that Anchor could drink his fill, and he sat by the fire longer than usual, knowing that tomorrow he would arrive. He tried to imagine it clearly, the letter in his vest, the woman at the door, what he would say. He turned over various versions of it in his mind and found each one wanting. He settled, eventually, on the simple truth, that the letter had been sitting at the post office with no route to reach her, and that someone had to bring it, and he had been the one who volunteered. That was all. It was plain and honest, and it required nothing from her except to receive what was hers. But somewhere underneath that plainness, he was aware of the other truth, the one he had not examined too carefully since the post office, which was that he had wanted to come. Not because the letter was urgent, not out of simple duty, but because something in him had lit up at the sound of her name connected to a real and reachable place, and he had followed that light without stopping to ask if it was reasonable. The fourth day was a Thursday, and the morning broke clean and cold, the sky an achingly clear blue that made the yellow-green spring grass look almost luminous. He had perhaps 15 miles to cover, according to the old man, at Mineral Creek's directions, which he had asked for on his way back out of the trading post. Follow the tributary north until you see the double butte that looks like a man wearing a hat, then bear northeast for 6 miles until you find a windmill and a water tank and a long, low house with a yellow door. He found the double butte by mid-morning. He bore northeast. He found the windmill turning slowly in the April wind at just past noon, and beyond it, the long, low house with its yellow door, and the garden that someone had worked hard against the stubborn caliche soil, and a rope strung between 2 cedar posts. She was not hanging laundry this time. She was on her knees in the garden, working a hoe between rows of something that had just come up green and tentative from the ground, wearing a dark blue dress that was practical rather than fine, with her red-brown hair pinned up and a battered straw hat on her head against the noon sun. She did not hear him coming immediately because the wind was in the wrong direction, and he had a moment of riding toward her in which the whole landscape seemed to hold itself very still. She looked up when Anchor was perhaps 40 yards out, and she rose from her knees in one fluid motion, her hand going to the hoe as a reflex, which was the practical response of a woman living alone on the frontier. She was not quite what he had constructed from memory and dream. She was better, and also more real. Her face was open and watchful, with high cheekbones and those gray-green eyes that he had given her in his dream as if he had known them, and she was perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with the kind of directness in her expression that came from having made a lot of decisions on her own. He slowed Anchor to a walk and came to a stop 12 feet from the edge of the garden, taking off his hat because that was the right thing to do. "Ma'am," he said, "I am looking for Miss Helen Dawson." She studied him with those clear eyes, cataloging him the way a sensible woman catalogs a strange man who arrives unannounced on horseback. "You have found her," she said. Her voice was steady and low, carrying a careful quality, not unfriendly but not yet open. "My name is Elijah Graves," he said. "I work cattle for the Rocking T out of Fort Worth. I stopped at the post office in town before leaving, and your postmaster told me there was a letter for you that had been sitting uncollected. The mail route out this way is disrupted, so I offered to bring it." He reached inside his vest and produced the square of oilskin, unwrapped it carefully, and held out the cream-colored envelope. Helen Dawson looked at the envelope, then she looked at him, then she looked at the envelope again. "You rode from Fort Worth," she said slowly, "to bring me a letter." "Yes, ma'am. That is 4 days' riding." "About that, I was not counting strictly." She descended from the garden with the hoe still in her hand, not threatening with it, just carrying it the way a working woman carries a tool she does not see any reason to put down yet. She stopped at the edge of the cultivated ground and looked at him steadily. "That letter could have been sent by post," she said. "It could have been held at the post office until June, when the supply wagon route comes back," he agreed. "I decided that seemed too long." She was quiet for a moment, those gray-green eyes reading him with an intelligence that he found both slightly unnerving and completely compelling. "Why?" she asked. It was a single, direct word, and it deserved a single, direct answer. He considered giving her the practical answer, the one about civic duty and neighborly decency and the obligations of a man who happened to be traveling in a given direction. He could see that she would not be fooled by it. She had the face of a woman who had been lied to by practicality before and had learned to spot the shape of it. "I am not sure I can fully account for it," he said honestly. "But I drove cattle through this part of the country 2 summers ago, and I believe I may have seen you at a distance, and I did not stop then, and something in me has been minding that ever since." The silence that followed was the length of a long breath. She looked at him the way you look at something that has surprised you and you are still deciding how to feel about it. "Get down off that horse," she said finally. "You have ridden 4 days, and it is noon, and I have coffee and cornbread, and whatever else you might be. You are at minimum someone who has done me a kindness." He swung down from Anchor, who stood patiently, and looked around at the homestead with his usual professorial interest. "I appreciate that, Miss Dawson." "Helen," she said, and walked toward the yellow door. He tied Anchor to the post near the water trough and followed her. The inside of the house was a revelation of what one determined person could do with limited materials and considerable taste. The walls were whitewashed and hung with things she had clearly made herself, braided rag rugs on the earthen floor. Curtains at the 2 windows made of flour sacking dyed with something that had turned them a warm amber color. There was a fireplace with a good iron stove beside it, a table of solid carpenter's work, 4 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised him, and through an open door, the suggestion of a sleeping room kept private by a curtain of blue calico. She put the coffee on and set the cornbread on the table, and then she sat down across from him and took the letter and looked at the handwriting on the front. Something in her face changed, a softening around the eyes and then a tightening, the way a face moves when it encounters something it has been both wanting and dreading. "Do you know who it is from?" he asked. "My aunt in Richmond," she said. "She is the only person who writes to me." She turned it over. "She wrote to me in December after my father died. I suppose this is the follow-up. She opened it with a practical penknife she took from her apron pocket, unfolded the 2 pages inside, and read them in the steady silence of someone accustomed to reading alone. He drank his coffee and looked at the shelf of books. He could see Dickens and something by George Eliot, and what appeared to be a farming almanac from 1875, and a Bible that looked genuinely well used. When she finished reading, she set the letter on the table and looked at the window for a moment. "Good news or difficult news?" he asked, because the silence was asking for something. "She is inviting me to come to Richmond," Helen said. "She says the frontier is no place for a young woman alone, and that I should come and live with her, and she will find me a suitable situation. She said the word suitable in the way you say a word that other people have invested with meaning you do not share. And what do you think of that?" he asked. She looked at him directly, and there was a spark in those gray-green eyes that was not quite amusement but was something adjacent to it. "I think my aunt has never tried to grow a garden in caliche soil," she said. "And I think she does not understand that a person can be attached to a place for reasons that have nothing to do with convenience." He nodded. He understood that perfectly. "Your father built this place," he said. "My father and I built it together," she said, with a quiet emphasis on the "and" that told him everything. 12 years ago when I was 11 and he was determined we were going to make something from nothing out here, and we did." She paused. "He died in February, pneumonia." She said it plainly, without decoration, the way people speak about losses that are too large for ornament. "I have been running it since. Pete Calloway helps me with the heavy work, but it is my land and my garden and my cattle, and I am not going to Richmond to find a suitable situation." He thought of the old man at Mineral Creek and his careful observation about what a hard piece of land it was to work. He thought of this woman on her knees in the garden with a hoe growing things from the ground through sheer determination. "That seems like a sound decision to me," he said. She looked at him again with that assessing quality, and this time there was something warmer underneath it. "You are a different kind of man than I usually get riding up to this gate," she said. "What kind usually comes?" "The kind who wants to buy the land cheap because they figure a woman alone will sell," she said matter-of-factly. "Or the kind who figures a woman alone might want company for reasons that are not her idea. I have sent 3 of those on their way in the last 2 months." She said it without drama, as a simple statement of her circumstances. "Pete Calloway keeps a rifle loaded by the barn door, which helps." "It sounds like you have handled things capably," he said. "I have," she said simply and without false modesty. "Then why did you come? The real answer, not the one about civic duty and male roots." He set his coffee cup down. She deserved the whole truth again, and he found to his own mild astonishment that he wanted to give it to her. "I heard your name," he said, "from the postmaster, and something woke up in me that has been quiet for a long time, and I followed it without stopping to see if it was sensible." He paused. "It was not the sensible choice." "No," she agreed. "But I am here, and you have your letter, and you have told your aunt's invitation what you think of it. And if it would not inconvenience you too greatly, I would like very much to stay for one more cup of coffee and ask you about those books on your shelf." Helen Dawson looked at him for a long moment, and then she got up and poured him another cup of coffee, and the afternoon began. Pete Calloway turned up at supper time, as was apparently his custom, a man of 60 or so with a face like ancient leather, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He took one look at Elijah sitting at the table across from Helen, with the remains of supper between them and a conversation going that had covered, in the course of 3 hours, books and cattle, and the year's planting calendar, and the nature of the Palo Duro country, and what Helen's father had been like, and what Elijah's father had been like, and the state of Texas politics and the proper way to make biscuits. And Pete simply sat down in the spare chair and helped himself to the leftover coffee and said, "You staying the night in the barn, then?" which was directed at Elijah and was not precisely a question. "If Miss Dawson will allow it," Elijah said. "Helen," she said again, and Pete looked between the two of them with the expression of a man who has seen the weather and knows what is coming. "The barn is clean," Pete said. "There is fresh hay in the first stall. Do not let your horse near the gray mare because she bites strangers." "I will keep that in mind," Elijah said. He slept in the barn that night on good clean hay with his bedroll and his saddle under his head. An anchor stood in the stall next to him chewing thoughtfully, and outside the wind made its slow way across the flat land and set the windmill turning. He lay awake for a while listening to it and thinking about the afternoon. She was extraordinary. He had sensed something from 100 yards and a 30-second glimpse, and he had been right, which was both gratifying and somewhat alarming, because it confirmed that the instinct he had followed without examination was the right one, which meant he had to take it seriously. She was intelligent in the way that self-educated people are, with wide gaps filled by genuine curiosity and deep knowledge in the specific areas that had interested her. She could talk about Dickens and she could talk about soil composition, and she had opinions about both that were worth hearing. She ran a homestead alone. She had sent 3 men packing in 2 months and clearly had the wherewithal to send more. She was not going to Richmond to find a suitable situation. He was in considerable trouble, he decided. The pleasant kind. He did not leave the next morning. He told himself he would leave by afternoon, and then afternoon came and he was mending a section of fence with Pete while Helen worked in the garden, and Pete said nothing about the fence needing mending, simply handed him a pair of pliers and worked beside him in companionable silence. After supper, Helen read aloud from Middlemark for an hour, sitting near the lamp with Pete in one chair and Elijah in another, and her voice in the lamplight reading George Eliot was something that settled in his chest the same way her laugh had settled there from 100 yards away 2 summers ago, with the quiet authority of something that intends to stay. He left the following morning, a Saturday. He had to be back at the rocking tee before May branding, which gave him a firm deadline that felt, this morning, unwelcome in a way it never had before. He saddled anchor while the sky was still the deep blue of very early morning, and Helen came out of the yellow door with a packet of cornbread wrapped in cloth and a small jar of honey. "For the road," she said. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He stowed the cornbread in his saddlebag and turned back to her. In the early light her gray-green eyes were darker, the color of the deep grass, and the wind was pulling at her hair the same way it had 2 years ago, the same way he had dreamed it. "I would like to come back," he said. It was the simplest, most direct thing he could think of, and she was a woman who had proven she appreciated directness. She looked at him steadily. "You have a cattle ranch 4 days riding away," she said. "That is not a no," he said. Something moved in her face, a careful thing, like a door opening very slowly on a room that had been shut for a while. "No," she agreed, "it is not." He put his hat on and swung up into the saddle. "I will write to you," he said. "I know where the post office is," she said, "even if the mail route is currently unreliable." There was the beginning of something that was not quite a smile but wanted to be. "I will try to improve on the mail route," he said. She laughed then, a short, real sound that the wind caught and carried, and it settled in his chest where it had always been going to go, and he turned anchor west and rode. The 4 days back were slower, emotionally, than the 4 days out had been, because going out he had been carried by the clean energy of an impulse not yet examined, and coming back he was weighted with everything he had found. He thought about her for 4 days solidly. He thought about the way she held a hoe like she was born to it and read George Eliot like she had been born to that too, and about how she had said, "My father and I built it together," with that particular emphasis. He thought about the yellow door. He thought about Middlemark read aloud in lamplight. He arrived back at the rocking tee on Wednesday and Dutch Holloway looked him over and said, "You look like a man who found something he was not looking for." And Elijah said, "That is approximately right," and Dutch shook his head with the philosophical tolerance of a man who had been married for 20 years and recognized the signs. He wrote to her that same week. It took him 4 drafts, which was 3 more than he had ever needed for any piece of writing in his life, because the first three versions sounded either too forward or too formal, or, in one case, genuinely ridiculous. The fourth version said what he meant without embellishment, that he had thought about the homestead and the conversation and the afternoon and the reading aloud, and that he intended to come again in June if she would receive him, and that he hoped the garden was coming along. He sent it with a postal stamp like a reasonable person. Her reply came 3 weeks later, because that was how long the post took to travel the distance between Fort Worth and the Palo Duro side, and he received it on a Saturday morning and read it standing in the yard of the rocking tee with the spring sun on his face. Her handwriting was the same educated hand he had seen on the envelope in the post office, precise and even. She wrote that the garden was doing well, that the peas had come up remarkably, and the squash looked promising, that Pete had repaired the windmill housing which had been making a sound that worried her, and that she had finished Middlemark and started Sela's Marner and it was very fine, and that she would receive him in June. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket with the same care. He had given her letter for 4 days in oilskin against his chest. May passed in the productive noise of branding season, long days and longer evenings, the sweet sharp smell of scorched hide, and the bawling of calves and the physical exhaustion that he found this year almost pleasant because it kept him from simply sitting somewhere thinking about gray-green eyes. Dutch noticed his increased industry and put him to work on the most demanding sections of the roundup, which suited everyone. He rode out in June on a Saturday morning with his saddlebags packed somewhat better than the first time, including a new copy of Daniel Deronda by George Eliot that he had acquired with some difficulty from a bookseller in Fort Worth, wrapped in brown paper and tucked carefully away. He also carried, on his own private initiative, and for reasons he was not prepared to analyze too closely, a small paper packet of good coffee beans from the Fort Worth General Store, because he had noted that her coffee was the thinner kind that came from an old can of grounds, and he thought she might enjoy better coffee, and this was perhaps the most transparent gesture of courtship he had ever made, and he was fully aware of it. He rode north and west for 4 days and arrived on a Wednesday morning to find the homestead looking better than he had left it, the garden fuller and greener, a section of fence newly repaired, and a brown and white calf that had apparently arrived sometime in May standing uncertainly beside its mother in the near pasture. Helen came out of the yellow door when she heard anchor, and she was wearing a different dress this time, one that was also practical but was a warm russet color that suited her, and her hair was down around her shoulders because it was morning and she had not pinned it up yet. She stopped on the step of the house and looked at him riding up, and she said nothing for a moment, and he said nothing, and the morning wind moved between them like a third party making introductions. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. "I know what you said." She was watching him come down from anchor with an expression that he was learning to read, open and guarded at once, like a window with the curtain half pulled back. "I just was not entirely sure the saying would hold up against 4 days of hard riding. I am a man of my word," he said, which was true. "And the riding was not as hard as the first time because I knew where I was going." She descended the step and came toward him, and he produced from his saddlebag the paper-wrapped book and the packet of coffee beans, holding them out. She took the coffee first and looked at it, then looked at him. "Coffee," she said. "Better coffee," he said. "I noticed you were running on the old can variety." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, the real laugh, the one that went all the way through her, and it was considerably louder and more wonderful than the version that had crossed 100 yards of open ground 2 years ago. "Elijah Graves," she said, "you are a very particular kind of man." "The book is George Eliot as well," he said. "Daniel Deronda." "In case you had run out." She took the book and unwrapped it with the same carefulness with which a person unwraps something they are afraid of wanting too much, and she read the title and looked up at him with an expression that was not guarded at all, for just a moment before the curtain came back. "Come in," she said, and I will make the bet her coffee. That second visit lasted 5 days. He worked alongside Pete on a section of the eastern fence line that needed new posts, and he helped Helen stack the cordwood that Pete had split but not yet moved. And in the evenings they sat and talked, and she read to him again, this time from Daniel Deronda. And on the third evening Pete found somewhere else to be after supper, and they sat alone at the table with the lamp between them and talked until past midnight about everything and nothing. Her father and his father, Missouri and Texas. What she wanted from the land and what he wanted from his life, which had not, until recently, been a question he had examined with any particular seriousness. What do you want? She asked him on that third evening directly and simply, the way she asked things. I want to ranch my own land someday, he said. Not work someone else's cattle forever. I have been saving with that in mind. He paused, and until very recently that was the whole of the answer to that question. She looked at him across the lamp. And now, she said. Now it is part of the answer, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment and then looked down at the table, and he thought he could see her deciding something, could almost see the internal negotiation. She was a woman who had been running things alone for 2 years, who had sent 3 men packing without apparent regret, who was not going to Richmond to find a suitable situation. She did not make decisions casually. He respected that enormously and also found it, right now, somewhat agonizing. I need to know you are serious, she said finally, still looking at the table. I am not a woman who has the luxury of being anything less than serious about what I am building here, and I cannot afford to be careless with the situation I am in. This land is mine and I intend to keep it, and if someone were to become part of it, they would have to understand what that means. It does not mean convenience. It means the drought years and the bad winters and the fence lines that need mending every spring and the soil that fights you every time you put something in it. I worked cattle through a winter that dropped to 0 for 6 weeks straight, he said. I know what hard land means. I am not afraid of it. That is the land, she said. I am talking about something more than the land. He leaned forward slightly across the table. Helen, he said quietly. I rode 4 days to bring you a letter that could have been sent by post. I came back a second time with coffee and a book. I am going to come back a third time and a fourth. If that is not serious, I do not know what word to use. She looked up from the table, and the lamp was between them, and her eyes in the lamplight were very clear. All right, she said. It was quiet and carefully measured, and it meant more than any louder declaration would have. He returned to the rocking tea and wrote to her weekly, regular as the sun, and she wrote back with a reliability that made the post office in Fort Worth a destination he found reasons to visit twice a week. Gerald Prout stopped asking where he was going and simply handed over any letter bearing her handwriting with the expression of a man who has accepted an ongoing situation. In August he came back for a third time, this time with proper supplies in his saddlebags because he planned to stay 2 weeks and actually help rather than just visiting. And this trip he and Pete put in a new section of cattle pen on the north side of the property that had been needed for a long time, dug the posts, and strung the wire and drove the corner stakes in the hard ground. Working alongside Pete for 2 weeks gave him a clear picture of the full extent of the homestead and what it needed. It needed time and money and steady work and someone who was going to show up, and he found that he wanted very much to be that person. On the 6th evening of that visit he asked Pete Calloway what he thought, because Pete had earned the right to be asked, and because Elijah genuinely respected the opinion. Pete looked at him from under the brim of his ancient hat and said, I think you had better not make her wait too long or she will decide she is fine on her own, which she is, and you will have lost your only sensible opportunity. He considered. She is also right that this is hard land and she has had a hard 2 years of it, so you had better be sure. There is no halfway measure with a woman like Helen Dawson. There is no halfway measure in me either, Elijah said. Then what are you waiting for? Pete said, with the tone of a man who has been patient with a slow student. What he was waiting for, he realized, was a particular kind of certainty that does not actually require waiting for, because it was already present. He had been certain since the post office in Fort Worth. He had been certain since he saw her from 100 yards in the wind 2 years before that. He had just been letting her arrive at the same place in her own time, because she was not a woman you hurried. He asked her on the 9th evening of that visit. They were sitting on the step of the yellow door watching the evening come down over the plain, the sky going through its magnificent western theater of orange and rose and deep purple, the windmill turning slowly. He had been working on how to phrase it, and none of the phrasings felt adequate, so he dispensed with phrasing and said the true thing plainly. "Helen," he said, "I would like to marry you if you will have me. I know what this land means to you, and I do not intend to take it from you or change what you have built here. I want to be part of it, if you will let me be. I want to be here through the droughts and the bad winters and the fence lines in spring, and I want to hear you read George Eliot in the evenings for the rest of my life." The purple deepened, and the first star appeared, and Helen looked at the plain and was quiet for what felt like a very long time, though he thought he could see the answer in the way she was holding herself, in the loosening of something careful that had been held carefully for a long time. "You have cattle in Fort Worth," she said. "I have a job in Fort Worth," he said, "which is a different thing. I can give notice. Dutch Holloway will find another man. It will take him about a week." "You have been saving for your own land," she said. "I have," he said, "and this land already exists and needs exactly what I have been saving toward, which seems efficient." She turned and looked at him then, and her eyes were very serious and also shining slightly at the edges with something he had never seen in them before, and she said, "I am not an easy woman to live with, Elijah. I have strong opinions about things, and I am accustomed to running this place my way, and I will not simply defer to someone because they have a legal authority to demand it. I am not interested in your deference," he said. "I am interested in your company, your conversation, your opinions, and your reading aloud in the evenings, and your cornbread. The cornbread is exceptional." She made a sound that started as something that might have been a sob and turned immediately into a laugh, the real laugh, and she covered her mouth with her hand and looked at him with those shining eyes, and then she said, "Yes, Elijah Graves. Yes, I will marry you." He did not whoop or pump his fist, or do any of the things a man might do in different circumstances. He simply reached over and took her hand, which was calloused and capable and warm, and held it while the last of the orange light went from the sky, and the stars came out in their extravagant abundance. "When?" he said. "Give me time to write to my aunt in Richmond," she said. "She will be very smug about it, but she will also send a proper tablecloth and possibly some decent tea, and I would not mind the tea." He laughed, and she laughed too, and they sat on the step of the yellow door holding hands while the night settled down around them and the windmill turned. He went back to Fort Worth one last time, collected his wages and his modest savings from Dutch Holloway, who shook his hand and said he was not surprised, and from the bunkhouse retrieved his few possessions, his father's watch, a handful of books of his own, a second pair of boots. Dutch gave him a young mare as a parting gift, a red roan with good conformation who would add to the Dawson stock, and Elijah led her behind anchor for 4 days back through the canyon country with his bedroll and saddlebags, and his father's watch, and the feeling of a man riding toward rather than away from. He arrived back at the homestead on a Friday in late September to find Helen directing Pete in the placement of a second wash basin on the outside wall of the house, which she felt had become a practical necessity, and she turned when she heard him, and there was nothing of the guarded window this time, no curtain half drawn, just the full open light of her face looking at him with undisguised pleasure, and she walked across the yard to meet him and took both his hands and said, "You are here." "I said I would be," he said. "You did," she said, and then more quietly, "I am very glad." They were married in November of 1878. The nearest preacher came from a settlement 40 miles east and performed the ceremony inside the house, because November in the Panhandle was no time for an outdoor service, and the witnesses were Pete Calloway, who wore a clean shirt for the occasion and appeared deeply moved by the whole thing without once admitting it, and a neighboring homesteader woman named Martha Suggs, who had driven 12 miles in her wagon because Helen had mentioned it at the trading post, and Martha Suggs was not a woman who missed a wedding if she could help it. The ceremony was brief and plain and genuine, conducted in front of the fireplace with the good iron stove burning beside it and the yellow door shut against the November wind. And when the preacher said, "Do you take this man?" Helen looked at Elijah with those clear gray-green eyes and said, "I do," with the same decisive certainty she put into everything. And when the preacher said, "Do you take this woman?" Elijah said, "I do," with the weight of a man who has never in his life said 2 words he meant more. Martha Suggs wept. Pete Calloway cleared his throat repeatedly. The preacher performed his function with admirable economy, and then accepted a cup of Helen's coffee, which was now consistently the good kind, and a piece of cornbread, and drove away into the November afternoon with his horse and his Bible, and what appeared to be a look of genuine satisfaction. The first year of their marriage was exactly what Helen had promised it would be, and exactly what Elijah had promised he understood. It was hard work, and occasionally difficult and relentlessly interesting. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a bitter one, the kind that drives cattle into ravines and freezes the water in the tanks and makes a man question every decision that led him to the Panhandle. They lost 4 head of cattle, and the wind took part of the barn roof in a January storm that lasted 2 days straight, and they spent those 2 days mending the roof with frozen fingers and arguing companionably about the best technique. And at the end of it they were both half frozen and entirely satisfied with the result. He had been right that she was not an easy woman to live with, in the sense that she had strong opinions and expressed them clearly, and did not back down without a reason that she found genuinely persuasive. He did not find this difficult. He found it most days thoroughly enjoyable, because she was right often enough that the arguments were useful, and on the occasions when he was right, she acknowledged it with a straightforwardness that made the acknowledgment feel like a real thing rather than a capitulation. She was also unexpectedly, privately tender, not in public ways, not in the performance of affection, but in small, consistent ways that accumulated over the months into something that overwhelmed him sometimes with its quiet weight. She brought him coffee without being asked when she could see he was working hard. She mended his shirt without comment and returned it folded on the chair by his side of the bed. She read to him in the evenings with the same reliability and pleasure that she had brought to it when he was a guest, and she chose books she thought he would find as interesting as ones she wanted to read herself, which was a consideration that moved him more than he could easily explain. He kept the letter she had written him, the first one, in his father's watch case. She found out about this in the spring of 1879 and said nothing about it for 3 days, and then finally said, "You kept the letter," which was an observation. "I did," he said. "It was not a very interesting letter," she said. "It was mostly about the peas." "The peas were coming up remarkably," he said. That seemed important. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the room and kissed him, which settled the question of what she thought about the letter. In the summer of 1879, they had occasion to deal with a genuine dispute about the eastern boundary of the property, which a neighboring man named Fowler had been quietly expanding since Helen's father died, moving survey stakes by increments in the hope that a woman alone would not notice or would not know how to contest it. Helen had noticed. She had documented it carefully in a journal she kept, noting the positions, the dates, the changes. When Elijah arrived, she brought him the journal and laid it on the table and said, "I need your help with this because it requires 2 people to do it properly, but I want you to understand that I solved the evidentiary problem before you arrived." They went together to the county surveyor in the nearest town, which required a 2-day trip, and Helen laid her documentation before the surveyor's office with the confidence of a woman who knows exactly what she has. The surveyor ruled in her favor. Fowler moved his stakes back and did not speak to them for a year, which everyone found acceptable. Elijah wrote to Pete about the resolution of the boundary dispute, because Pete had retired to his daughter's family in San Antonio in the spring and deserved to know how things stood. Pete wrote back that he was not surprised and that he was glad they had settled it, and that his daughter's cooking was very good but not as good as Helen's cornbread, which was high praise from a man of Pete's reserved nature. The autumn of 1879 brought news that Helen was carrying a child, which she informed Elijah about with her characteristic directness over breakfast one September morning. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she told him later was the most openly and unguardedly joyful thing she had ever seen on a human face, and he came around the table and held her, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was unusual for both of them. Their son was born in May of 1880 in the Yellow Door house in the Panhandle, delivered by Martha Suggs, who had turned out to have more practical medical knowledge than her casual country manner suggested. He was a solid, loud, healthy boy who came into the world with strong opinions that he apparently inherited from both parents, and they named him Thomas after Helen's father. Thomas Graves was, from the very beginning, his mother's son in temperament and his father's son in stubbornness, which meant he was going to be a considerable handful, and also, probably, a person worth knowing. Helen nursed him in the evenings while Elijah read aloud, because they had reversed the reading by now, taking turns, and it seemed right and good that their son's first experience of language would be the sound of both his parents' voices reading the good things from books. The homestead grew in the years that followed. Elijah put his savings into expanding the cattle herd with careful, patient purchases of good breeding stock, and the red roan mare that Dutch Holloway had given him proved to be an excellent addition to the working horses. They repaired and expanded the barn, added a proper root cellar for storage, and in 1882 built a second structure on the property, a small separate room off the main house with its own stove, which Helen declared she needed as a proper workroom, and which Elijah built to her exact specifications, because she had precise ideas about where the shelving should go and the angle of the window for light. She used the workroom for her writing. This was something he had not known about her until they had been married almost a year, when he found a stack of papers on the table one afternoon that turned out to be a record of everything that had happened on the homestead since her father's death, written in her careful hand with a precision and a quality of observation that made it something more than a simple diary. She was embarrassed when he found it, in the way that people are embarrassed by things they care about, and he read several pages while she stood watching him with that slightly unguarded expression she got when something mattered to her, and then he looked up and said, "Helen, this is extraordinary writing." She had kept writing ever since. She corresponded with a publication called the Texas Farmer's Almanac that printed, occasionally, practical accounts of frontier homesteading, and two of her pieces appeared in 1882 and one more in 1883, under the name Helen Graves, and Martha Suggs drove 12 miles again when she saw the first one in print to tell Helen that it was the finest thing she had ever read, which was probably not literally true, but was meant with complete sincerity. In 1883, Helen's aunt in Richmond finally made the journey to visit them. Her name was Helen Dawson, a woman of 62 who had written several letters over the years updating her Richmond address and updating her concern about Helen's situation, and who had eventually, after Thomas was born, and the letters described a thriving rather than precarious existence, updated her concern to something closer to respectful curiosity. She came by train to Amarillo, and then by wagon hired from a livery stable in town, a dignified woman in good traveling clothes who arrived at the Yellow Door on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and stood looking at the homestead with an expression that was slowly revising itself. The tablecloth she had sent after the wedding was on the table. Helen had used it for every occasion since, and it was somewhat worn but still fine. And Catherine sat at the table under it and drank the good coffee and ate cornbread and met Thomas, who was 3 years old and forthright about his opinions on visitors, and looked at Elijah across the table with the careful eyes of a woman who has spent 62 years developing a talent for reading people. "I had imagined something grimmer," she admitted finally, with an honesty that Helen had clearly inherited. "I had imagined struggle and privation, and a niece who was suffering bravely. I had been ready to renew my invitation with greater urgency." "I am sorry to disappoint you," Helen said, and it was the kind of apology that is not an apology at all. "You have not disappointed me," Catherine said. She looked at Elijah again. "How did you two meet?" she asked in the tone of someone who has been waiting to ask this and finally found the right moment. "He brought me a letter," Helen said. Catherine looked at Elijah. "The post office could not manage that." "The mail route was disrupted," Elijah said carefully, "and it seemed like it should not wait until June." Catherine looked between the two of them and clearly saw much more in the exchange than the simple words contained. "Well," she said after a moment, "I suppose that is one way to meet someone." She picked up her coffee cup. "A very roundabout way. The most direct route between two people is not always a straight line," Elijah said. And Helen looked at him from across the table with that look that was specifically his, the one she kept for the moments when he said something that pleased her. And Catherine watched this exchange and set down her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who has received the answer to the question she really wanted answered. Catherine stayed for 2 weeks and was more useful than anyone expected, partly because she had a practical intelligence underneath the Richmond sensibility, and partly because she had finally accepted that her niece was not going to be removed from this place, and had decided to be interested in it instead. She played with Thomas, who initially resisted her on principle, and then capitulated completely when she produced from her traveling trunk a mechanical tin rooster that wound up and pecked at a painted corn kernel, a toy that Thomas immediately claimed as a permanent possession. She and Helen talked for hours each evening after Thomas was in bed and Elijah had stepped outside to check on the horses, conversations that he could hear the edges of through the walls, the low register of two women who share blood and are figuring out how to know each other as adults. He was glad of it. Helen had been running alone for a long time, and the aunt who had seemed like an obstacle from a distance turned out, close up, to be someone who genuinely loved her, only imperfectly. When Catherine left, she embraced Helen with a sincerity that had no Richmond formality in it at all, and she shook Elijah's hand and said, "You are a good man," with the gravity of a statement she had been considering for 2 weeks and was now prepared to stand behind completely. Then she went back to Amarillo in the hired wagon and from there by train to Richmond, and she wrote letters regularly from then on, good letters, full of news and humor and an increasing interest in the homestead's progress. The spring of 1884 brought a dry stretch that worried them. April came and went with almost no rain, and May was the same, the sky clear and merciless while the garden strained, and the cattle grew thin on the drought-reduced grass. They moved the herd to the canyon bottom where the creek still ran, rotating grazing carefully to preserve what ground cover remained, and Helen watered the garden by bucket from the tank, which meant carrying water twice a day in the heat, and she did it without complaint, though Elijah could see it costing her. He built a simple irrigation channel from the tank to the garden in June, a project that took 2 weeks of digging in the heat, and satisfied him in a way that practical solutions always satisfied him. It was not perfect, but it reduced the burden enough that the garden survived the drought summer and produced a harvest that was modest but sufficient. 3 of the neighboring homesteads were not as lucky, and Helen organized a sharing arrangement with Martha Suggs and 2 other women in the area, trading skills and preserved food through the hardest months, which was the kind of thing she did naturally, and without needing to be organized about it first. The drought broke in September with a 3-day rain that soaked the ground deep and turned everything green with almost alarming speed. Elijah stood in the yard in the rain on the second day of it with his hat off, and his face turned up to the sky like a man receiving something he had been waiting for a long time. And Helen came and stood beside him and did the same thing. And Thomas, who was 4 years old and entirely uncertain about the judgment of two adults standing in the rain with their hats off, watched them from the doorway with profound 3-foot suspicion. In the autumn of 1884, Helen told him she was expecting again, with the same directness she had used the first time, and he had the same response, which was to set down whatever he was holding and look at her with all his defenses completely down. Their daughter was born in April of 1885, a spring baby, small and fierce, and announcing herself from the first moment with a clarity of purpose that made Thomas look up from his tin rooster with respectful attention. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but for a name that suited her, and Clara Graves grew up understanding from her earliest awareness that this land was hers in the same way it had been her mother's and her grandfather's, something built and fought for and worth the fighting. Thomas, at 5, took his duties as older brother with an earnestness that made both his parents work hard to keep straight faces. He brought Clara in her first weeks small offerings of objects he considered valuable: a smooth, flat stone, a brass button he had found, the tin rooster briefly, which was then immediately reclaimed. He appointed himself, in the manner of 5-year-old boys, the official supervisor of her developmental progress, and reported to his parents each evening on what she had accomplished that day, a role he maintained with great seriousness for approximately a year, until Clara started moving under her own power, and the nature of supervision changed entirely. By 1886, the Graves homestead had become what Elijah had seen the bones of in his first visit 8 years before, a working ranch of real substance, with a solid cattle herd and productive garden, and a well-kept set of buildings, and 2 children who were growing up knowing both the hardness and the richness of the land. He had what he had saved toward his own land, earned with hands and time, and 4 days of riding through canyon country for a reason he could only half explain at the time. He thought about that sometimes in the evenings when Helen was reading or writing in her workroom, and Thomas was doing the homework that the traveling schoolteacher set for him on her monthly visits, and Clara was sitting on his knee demanding to know what a specific star was called, which was her current obsession. He thought about Gerald Prout and the green suspenders and the cream-colored envelope sitting uncollected on the post office shelf. He thought about how Gerald had said the letter could wait until June. He thought about how he had said some things could not wait, and had walked out with the letter and ridden 4 days, and found the yellow door and the gray-green eyes and the laugh that had been traveling toward him since 2 years before that, crossing 100 yards of open ground from a woman on a cattle drive who had not even seen him. He thought about what would have happened if he had left the letter for Clem Hodder's supply wagon. Helen would have received it eventually in June and read her aunt's invitation, and declined it as she certainly would have, and gone on managing the homestead alone, sending more men packing, becoming more self-sufficient and more sealed, and he would have gone on working someone else's cattle, saving toward land he had not found yet, and the distance between them would never have been covered because it would never have had occasion to begin being covered. The smallness of it, the letter on the shelf, Gerald Prout's green suspenders, the impulse he had followed without asking if it was sensible, which had turned out to be the most sensible thing he had ever done. Clara tugged his ear to bring his attention back to the stars, and he pointed up at the appropriate constellation and told her its name, and she said it back to him with the 4-year-old certainty that having named something is the same as knowing it, which perhaps it is. Helen looked up from her writing and caught his eye across the room, and she gave him the look, the one that was specifically his, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he had gotten everything right by accident, by following a light he could not name, by the simple grace of not leaving a letter on a shelf. In the years that followed, people in the area came to know the Graves homestead as a place where something had been built right, which is visible in the quality of the fences and the health of the cattle and the condition of the garden, and also in something less tangible, in the way the people inside the place moved around each other with ease and purpose, the way the yellow door was a real welcome rather than a formal one. Martha Suggs brought her daughter to visit and told the girl privately that if she wanted to know what a good marriage looked like, she should watch those two for an afternoon. Helen's Aunt Catherine visited twice more before her health made travel impractical, and her letters, when she could no longer come, were the kind that people save and read again. Thomas grew from the earnest 5-year-old supervisor to a lanky, serious-minded 10-year-old who was his mother's son in his precision and his father's son in his patient stubbornness, and who showed every sign of becoming, when he was grown, a person whose yes meant yes, and whose word held up against 4 days of hard riding. Clara was everything they had not thought to expect, quick and bright and argumentative and tender in the same moments, and she taught herself to read by following her mother's finger across the page with an intensity that burned through every difficulty. And at 5, she was reading simple things herself and demanding more challenging material by 6, which pleased her mother enormously and kept Elijah in regular conversation with the bookseller in Fort Worth about what would be appropriate for a very determined 7-year-old. On a Tuesday evening in October of 1888, 10 years after Elijah had ridden into the yard and found her in the garden with a hoe, Helen came to find him at the fence line where he was working in the last of the afternoon light and stood watching him for a moment before he noticed her. "What is it?" he asked, because she had an expression that was not quite readable. She held out a piece of paper. "Letter from the Texas Farmer's Almanac," she said. "They want to know if I would consider contributing regularly. A monthly column about frontier farming and homestead management." She said it in a careful, level voice. "They will pay for it." He looked at the letter and then at her and then at the letter again. "Helen," he said. "It is not Richmond," she said, which was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging that the aunt's invitation had ever felt like it might be tempting. "No," he said, "it is something else entirely." "I know," she said. "Will you do it?" She looked at the letter and then at the homestead behind her, the yellow door and the garden and the barn with the horses moving inside it and the windmill turning in the late afternoon wind. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I think I will." She wrote the column for 11 years, long after the Texas Farmer's Almanac changed its name and expanded its scope, until it became something read across several territories and then several states, and the name Helen Graves appeared monthly in the header above 2 pages of precise, practical, deeply observed writing about the frontier life that she had chosen and built and refused to be removed from. The letters that came in response went in a basket on the shelf beside the George Eliot and the Dickens, and the accumulated reading of 30 years in the Yellow Door house, and she answered as many of them as she could, because she knew what it was to be a woman alone on hard land, and to need to know that someone else had done it and found it worth the doing. Elijah kept the Rocking Tees brand on one small section of his herd for years after Dutch Holloway sold the ranch and moved to Dallas in 1885, a private acknowledgement of where he had come from and what that time had made of him. Dutch came through the Panhandle once in 1890 and stopped at the homestead for 2 days, and he sat at the table with the good coffee and the tablecloth from Richmond and looked at everything Elijah had built and said, "I told Helen the day I met her in Fort Worth," and Elijah said, "You never met Helen in Fort Worth," and Dutch said, "You are right, I did not. I am saying it poetically," and Helen laughed and said she appreciated the sentiment. The windmill turned. The garden grew. The cattle were good. Thomas learned to work a cattle pen at 8 and was competent at it by 10, and had strong opinions about herd management by 12 that were worth arguing with, which Elijah did regularly and with genuine pleasure. Clara filled 3 journals with pressed wildflowers and careful drawings before she was 7, and had opinions about everything, and could argue for each of them with a logic that was purely her mother's and a stubbornness that was purely her father's. And they sat at supper every evening with their 4 chairs around the carpenter's table, and talked about everything and nothing, the day's work and the books they were reading, and what Thomas thought about the irrigation schedule, and what Clara thought about the stars. And it was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that ordinary life is extraordinary when you are in the middle of it and paying attention. He had paid attention from the first day. That was the thing. He had paid attention to the letter on the shelf and the distance between Fort Worth and the Palo Duro, and the sound of a laugh crossing 100 yards of open ground, and he had followed his attention without asking if it was reasonable, and it had brought him here, to this table and this light, and this woman reading aloud in the evenings with her red-brown hair loose around her shoulders, here to the yellow door and the gray-green eyes and the garden that grew despite the hard caliche soil. Because the person working it refused to take no from the ground, he was grateful every day for the unreasonable impulse. He was grateful for Gerald Pruitt's green suspenders and the letter that had been sitting uncollected for 11 days and could have been held until June. He was grateful for the 4 days of riding and the oilskin around the cream envelope and the cornbread she had packed for his road home. He was grateful for all of it, every particular of it, because every particular had brought him to this, to a life that was exactly the shape of a life he had not known he wanted until the shape of it began. On their 10th anniversary, Helen gave him a book she had made herself, bound in leather and filled with her handwriting, and what she had written was the story of the homestead from the day her father had brought her there at 11 years old until the day Elijah had ridden up to the garden, and then beyond, through the fence building and the drought and the children and the column in the almanac, every particular of it. And at the end of the last page, she had written a single sentence in her careful hand. He brought me a letter that could have been sent by post, and I am grateful every day that he did not leave it for June. He read it sitting at the carpenter's table in the lamplight while she sat across from him and watched him read it, and when he finished he looked up at her and found that he had no words for the occasion that were adequate, which was an unusual circumstance for a man who had built a life on the principle of saying the true thing plainly. So he did not say anything. He set the book down carefully and got up from his chair and crossed to where she was sitting, and she rose to meet him, and he held her in the lamplight of the yellow door house, with the wind making the windmill turn outside and the children breathing quietly in their sleep. And they stood like that for a long time, in the ordinary extraordinary present of everything that had followed from one letter, from 4 days of riding, from the refusal to leave something important waiting for June. Outside, the Panhandle stars came out in their vast, generous numbers, the same stars that had watched him ride toward her for the first time 10 years before, the same stars she had looked at all her life from this piece of ground. The stars that Thomas would grow up under and Clara would name and draw in her careful journals. The stars that watched over the yellow door and the garden and the windmill turning and the fence lines mended every spring and all the hard work and tenderness of a life made properly from the most unreasonable beginning. The lamp burned steadily. The wind was mild. The children slept. The years ahead were as full and as unknown as the canyon country, beautiful and requiring all of a person's attention, and they were going to walk into them together, the way they had walked into everything since the Tuesday morning a letter sat on a shelf, waiting for someone to decide it was worth the writing. It had been worth every mile.